Welcome to Nadir Audio. In today's video, we're finally going to take a look at the Mani 2 phono preamp. So let's get started. So for the last few years, I've been using my Pro-Ject Phono Box DC as my primary phono preamp, and overall I really like it. I'll include a link to the original review I did in the description below, but I always wanted to compare it against some of the other popular entry-level phono preamps, especially this Mani 2 here. So a few months ago I did pick one up and I put it in my system and was using that as my primary phono preamp for a while, and then more recently I've been doing comparisons between the two. Now I have also moved on to more expensive phono preamps like this Music Hall Analog A3, and we'll be doing a full review of this in an upcoming video. But for this video we're mostly going to be comparing these two entry-level models. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the specifications of the Mani 2. So the Mani 2 comes packaged in the typical very simple box that Schiit Audio tends to use for all of their products. And so you get the unit itself, you get a really brief owner's manual, a couple of stickers, and then you get the sort of inexpensive wall wart power supply. Now I have read a lot about people using more expensive power supplies with these various phono preamps, and that's something I may experiment with down the road, but for this video we're just going to be using the power supplies that came with each of these two units. So the Mani 2 has a very clean and simple front panel. We just have a single LED power light here, so when we switch it on using the switch in the back, we just get a white light. Some people complain about it being too bright, but it doesn't really bother me. So when we flip it over, the back panel is also very simple. So we have our RCA in and outs. We have a binding post that you can use to ground the unit if your turntable requires that. And then we just have the power switch toggle and the input for the power supply that comes with it. So if we look at the bottom of the unit, we do get a few more settings. So we have a low frequency filter here, which can be handy if you have a lot of excessively warped records and you're worried about woofer excursion. We have our loading settings here. For most moving magnet systems, you can just leave those alone, but for some moving coil and other type of more exotic setups, you can change the loading. And similarly, we get a gain setting, which is going to be in its default position for most moving magnet, but you can up the gain a little if you need to for a moving coil or another type of cartridge. And that's it. So there is some configuration here, but overall it's a very simple unit. So when comparing these two entry-level phono preamps, we're going to be using my U-Turn Orbit turntable with the original Ortofon 2M Red cartridge that I purchased with it. And then we're going to be listening through my solid-state system, which I've been using for the last few months with the Mani 2. So that's the Saga preamp, my Vidar power amp, and then for speakers we're using the Triangle Bro 3s. So this whole system I think has pretty good synergy in general, and it works really well with the Mani 2. So when I first put the Mani 2 in my system, the impression I got was that it had a slightly more full-bodied and warmer presentation than the Phono Box DC. And for the most part, that impression carried over to when I did A/B comparisons more recently. So one thing that is important to note is that the output on the Mani 2 is slightly hotter than on the Phono Box DC. So you need to turn up the volume a little bit more with the Pro-Ject. So it translates to about just one click on the Saga preamp for me. But that's an important thing to do because otherwise the Phono Box DC will sound a little bit thinner than it actually is. But for the most part, yeah, I feel that it is a more full-bodied, warmer presentation on the Mani, whereas the Phono Box DC, there's a little bit less mid-range. It has a little bit more on the deep end of the bass, if you're listening to things that have a lot of deep bass. But on the high end, at first I thought the Phono Box DC was possibly a little bit tilted up because it sounded a tiny bit bright on some recordings, but that turns out not to be the case after listening to a lot of recordings through both of them. The high end is at about the same volume. It's really just the mid-range. It's slightly de-emphasized on the Phono Box DC, which can give it kind of a bright sound on some recordings, but the actual volume level is the same. And I will say that just in terms of resolving power across the entire frequency range, I think that both of these are pretty comparable. So they both are pretty resolving, and you get a lot of air in recordings that have air. Both of them do pretty well there. So I think to dive a little more deeply into it, we're going to look at 3 different vinyl records that I listened to, 2 of which where I think that the warmer presentation, the Mani 2, really helped out a bit. And then on a third one where I slightly preferred the Phono Box DC, where I think that slightly cooler presentation worked out really well. So one recording where I think the warmth of the Mani 2 really helped was on Bach Trios by Yo-Yo Ma, Chris Steele, and Edgar Meyer. Now this is a really good recording, and it's a beautiful recording and has lots of air as well, and both of the preamps were able to get that air, but it was really that mid-range, the sound of the cello that was just really beautiful here, and it was getting a lot of that detail in that frequency range that I really liked listening to this. Now again, I could enjoy listening to it on both of them, but this is one of the standouts where the Mani 2 was doing really well. And I think that it's important to remember too that in this video I'm only doing comparisons using this single turntable with this tone arm and with this Ortophon 2M Red. I think that the whole Ortophon 2M line sort of emphasizes clarity, so I think that the extra warmth is a welcome thing here, whereas if you were using possibly a more romantic sounding cartridge, then maybe that would be overkill. So I think that when you're comparing these, I think for phono preamps in this price range, you're just better off just buying multiple ones and doing your own comparisons, but a lot of it will come down to the specific turntable you're using and also the amplification and speakers. So another recording where I really liked the warmth of the Mani 2 was on Lotus Nomad. Now, as I had said earlier, the Phono Box DC can get a little bit of that lower end on the bass, and there is a little bit of that in this recording that the Phono Box DC was able to get, but the real beauty is sort of in the higher low end and in the mids on this recording, even with the bass guitar, and it really stood out more on the Mani 2. Also, there's just a lot of other percussive instruments, a lot of things in the mid-range of this recording that I think the Mani 2 was able to bring out. Now, there were no micro details that I couldn't also hear on the Phono Box DC, but they just sounded a little bit more full-bodied and a little bit more clear on the Mani 2, which I liked. Both of the phono preamps were able to kind of capture the energy of this recording, and so the sort of jump factor was still there. And I enjoyed listening to it on both of them, but that extra warmth, I think, just really made this recording sound amazing on the Mani 2 in a way I hadn't heard it sound before. So I think on this one, yes, definitely I would give it to the Mani 2. So one last recording I wanted to mention was Maiden Voyage by Herbie Hancock. And this was one of the few records I listened to where I felt like the slightly cooler presentation of the Phono Box DC actually suited this one really well. I was still getting enough warmth from the horns to make it sound really good, but it just sounded more natural, and there was just something about that slight coolness on the Phono Box DC on this recording I really enjoyed. Now, both of the preamps were pretty close. I really enjoyed listening to it on both of them, so it was a fairly subtle difference, but it was enough to give me a slight nod in favor of the Phono Box DC on this one. So I think for these two phono amps in general, it's really going to kind of come down to your personal preference, and again, it'll come down to what type of cartridge you're using and what kind of a system you have, and even the speakers would make a difference there. So I think in my system, with everything here, I slightly prefer the Mani 2, because I like that little bit of extra warmth, and a lot of the records, most of the records I listened to sounded slightly better with the Mani 2, I would say. But again, that's just a personal preference thing. I think you could be perfectly happy with either one of these. I think they're very comparable phono preamps, and at the price, these are both under $200. I'd say that it's worth investing in both if you're looking for a phono preamp. If you're just getting started and you want to kind of figure out what kind of sound you like, these do have very unique sound signatures in comparison to one another. So I think it's worth comparing them and see what works better in your system and what works better with your personal listening preferences. So I think that's it in this video, guys. So we are going to be doing some more turntable-based videos coming up. So we're going to be upgrading the Ortophon 2M Red on my Orbit to a 2M Blue. That'll probably be the next video. And then we are, of course, going to be doing a full dedicated video on the Music Hall Analog A3, which is sort of a step up into the next price range for phono preamps. But in the meantime, I think that covers everything, so I will see you all in the next video. Thanks for watching.